I'll be talking a little bit about punched card history, punched card humanities. But this is one of those situations where you fall down one of those rabbit holes when you're starting to write a talk. And I wound up pushing back a few hundred extra years, so I hope you'll bear with me as we reach back to some earlier quantitative and semi-computational humanities approaches. Digital history, we're told, is something different or new. Many of us know historians who used computers in the 1960s for things like demography or cliometrics, but what we do today, we're told, is a different beast. Commenting on these early punched card historians in 1999, Ed Ayers told us that the first computer revolution in history largely failed. Its failure, as Ayers claimed, was due to the statistical machinery not being up to the task of representing the nuances of human experience. We see this rhetoric of newness or novelty crop up all the time. It cropped up in pioneering digital history essays in the 90s and 2000s by Dan Cohen and Roy Rosenzweig, and we even see a touch of it, though tempered, in this conference's theme. To say that we are now at a unique historical moment is something common to pretty much everyone, everywhere, as far back as we can remember. And it's always a little bit true, right? It's true that every historical moment is unique, unprecedented. Digital history, with its unique combination of public humanities, media-rich interests, sophisticated machinery, quantitative approaches, it's pretty novel the way it is right now. But as the saying goes, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. Each thread making up digital history has a long past, and a lot of the arguments for or against it have been made many times before. Novelty tends to be a convenient illusion that helps us get funding. Not coincidentally, it's this tension that I'm going to highlight today, between revolution and evolution, between breaks and continuities, between historians who care about what makes a moment unique and those who care more about what connects humanity together. To be clear, I'm operating on two levels of narrative here. There's the narrative and the meta-narrative. The narrative is that history of digital history is one of continuities and fractures. The meta-narrative is that this very tension between uniqueness and self-similarity is what swings the pendulum between quantitative and qualitative historians. Now, my claim that debates over continuity and discontinuity are a primary driver of the quantitative-qualitative divide comes a bit out of left field, I know. So I'm going to back up a few hundred years and try to explain and contextualize this. Francis Bacon wrote that knowledge would be better understood if it were collected into orderly tables. His plea extended, of course, to historical knowledge and inspired renewed interest in a genre already over 1,000 years old at that time, which is the tabular chronology. These chronologies were world histories, aligning the pasts of several regions, which each reckoned the passage of time in different ways. Isaac Newton inherited this tradition and dabbled throughout his life in establishing a more accurate universal chronology, aligning biblical history with Greek legends, Egyptian pharaohs, and so forth. Newton brought to history the same mind he brought to everything else, one of stars and of calculations. Like his peers, Newton relied on historical accounts of astronomical observations to align simultaneous events across thousands of miles. Kepler and Scaliger, among others, also partook in this astronomical history. Where Newton departed from his contemporaries, however, was in his use of statistics for sorting out history. In the late 1500s, the average, or the arithmetic mean, was popularized by astronomers as a way of smoothing out noisy measurements. Newton co-opted this particular method to help him estimate the length of royal reigns, and thus the ages of various dynasties and kingdoms. On average, Newton figured, a king's reign lasted 18 to 20 years. If the history books recorded 5 kings, that means the dynasty probably lasted between 90 and 100 years. Newton was among the first to apply averages or arithmetic means to fill in chronologies, though not the first to apply them to human activity. By the late 1600s, demographic statistics of contemporary life, of births, burials, and the like, were becoming somewhat common. They were ways of revealing divinely ordered regularities in society. Incidentally, this example of Newton's and using averages is probably part of our illustrious tradition of co-opting methods from other fields to use on our own, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. But that aside, the point that I made about demographic statistics is somewhat important, that these averages represented divine regularities. Human statistics began as a means to uncover universal truths, and they continue to be employed in that manner. Newton's method did not quite pass muster. Skepticism grew rapidly on the whole prospect of mathematical history. Criticizing Isaac Newton in 1782, for example, Samuel Musgrave argued, in part, that there are no discernible universal laws of history operating in parallel to the universal laws of gravity. Nature can be mathematized, people cannot. This is a refrain we will hear many times. However, not everybody agreed. Francesco Algarotti passionately argued that Newton's calculation of average rains, that is, the application of math to history, was one of Newton's greatest achievements. Even Voltaire tried Newton's method, aligning Chinese chronologies with Western dates using average lengths of rains, just as Newton did. Which brings us to the earlier continuity-discontinuity point, which is quantitative history stirs debate in part because it draws together two activities Immanuel Kant sets in opposition: the tendency to generalize and the tendency to specify. The tendency to generalize, later dubbed nomothetic, often describes the sciences, extrapolating general laws from individual observations. Examples include the laws of gravity, theory of evolution, by natural selection, and so forth. The tendency to specify, later dubbed idiographic, describes mostly what we do in the humanities, understanding specific contingent events in their own context with awareness of their subjective experiences. This could manifest as a microhistory of one parish of the French Revolution, a critical reading of Frankenstein focused on gender dynamics, and so forth. These two approaches are not mutually exclusive. They frequently come in contact, in fact, around scholarship dealing with the past. Paleontologists, for example, apply general laws of biology and geology to tell the specific story of prehistoric life on Earth. Astronomers, similarly, combine natural laws and specific observations to trace the origins of our universe. Historians have, with somewhat cyclically recurring intensity, engaged in similar efforts. One recent nomothetic example is that of cliodynamics. The practitioners use data and simulations to discern generalities, such as why nations fail or what causes war. Recent idiographic historians associate more with a cultural or theoretical turn in historiography, often focusing on microhistories or the subjective experience of historical actors. However, both of these tendencies seem to often meet around quantitative history, but the conversation began, of course, well before an urge towards quantification. They often fruitfully align and improve one another when they work in concert. For example, when a historian cites a common historical pattern in order to highlight and contextualize an event which deviates somewhat from it. But more often, nomothetic and idiographic historians find themselves at odds. Newton extrapolated laws for the length of kings and was criticized for thinking that mathematics had any place in the domain of the uniquely human. Newton's contemporaries used human statistics to argue for divine regularities, and this was eventually criticized as encroaching on human agency, free will, and the uniqueness of subjective experience, although not taking those terms at the time. I'll highlight some moments in this debate, focusing on the English-speaking historians, and we'll conclude with what we today might learn from foibles of quantitative historians who came before us. Let me reiterate, though, that quantitative is not the same as nomothetic history, but they do invite each other, so I don't want to be ahistorical by dividing up the story. So we can start with, for example, Henry Buckle, who in 1857 tried to bridge the two cultures divide posed by C.P. Snow a century later. He wanted to use statistics to find general laws of human progress and apply those generalizations to the histories of specific nations. Buckle was well aware of historiography and the place between nomothetic and idiographic cultures that it had. In fact, he wrote, "It is the business of the historian to mediate between these two parties and reconcile their hostile pretensions by showing the point at which their respective studies ought to coalesce." In direct response, however, James Froude wrote that there can be no science of history. The whole idea of science and history being related was nonsensical to Froude, like talking about the color of sound. They simply did not connect. This was a small exchange in a much larger Victorian debate that pit narrative history against a growing interest in scientific history. The latter rose on the coattails of growing popular interest in science, much like our debates today align with broader discussions about data science, computational, and the visible economic success of startup culture and Silicon Valley culture. This is, by the way, the same period that yesterday's keynote highlighted, when the 19th century, there was this 19th century urge to to establish urban laws. By now, we also begin seeing historians leveraging public trust in scientific methods as a means of political control and pushing their own agendas. This happened in concert with the rise of punched cards and eventually computational history. Perhaps the best example of this particular turn was with the American census in the late 19th century. Covering it briefly, a group of 19th century American historians, journalists, and census chiefs misused statistics, historical atlases, and the machinery of the Census Bureau to publicly argue for the disintegration of the US Western frontier in the late 19th century. These moves were made to consolidate power in the American West and wrestle control from the native populations who still lived there. They accomplished this in part by publishing popular atlases showing that the Western frontier was so fractured that it was difficult to maintain and defend. Obviously, if that's the case, more military and governmental power and control force would need to be brought to that region. And the argument turned out at the time was very compelling. Part of what drove the statistical power and the scientific legitimacy of these arguments was a new method in 1890 of entering census data on punched cards and processing them into tabulating machines. The mechanism itself was wildly successful, and the inventor's company wound up merging with a few others to eventually become IBM. As was true of punched cards humanities projects through the time of Father Busa, this work was largely driven by women. It's worth pausing to remember that the history of punch card computing is also a history of the consolidation of government power. Seeing like a computer was, for decades, seeing like a state. And how we see influences what we see, what we care about, how we think. Recall the Ed Ayers quote I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the talk. He said that the statistical machinery of early quantitative historians could not represent the nuance of historical experience. This doesn't just mean that the math they used, it also means the actual physical machinery involved. See, one of the truly groundbreaking punch card technologies at the turn of the century was the card sorter. Each card could represent a person or a household or whatever else, which is sort of legible one at a time, but completely illegible once you start getting to huge stacks or boxes of cards. This was still well before computers, but machines were being developed which could sort these cards into one of 12 different pockets based on which holes were punched. So for example, if you had a card punched for a person's age, you could sort the stacks of cards with age punches into 10 different pockets to break up the age groups, 0 through 9, 1 through 10, 11 through 20, and so forth down the line. This turned out to be really useful for eyeball estimates. If your 20 to 29 pocket was twice as full as your 10 to 19 pocket after all the cards were sorted, you had a pretty good idea of the age distribution. Over the next 50 years, this convenience would shape the social sciences in somewhat profound ways. Consider demographics or marketing. Both developed in the shadow of punch cards and both relied heavily on what's called segmentation, the breaking of society into discrete categories based on easily punched attributes. Age ranges, racial backgrounds, and so forth. These would be used to, among other things, determine who is interested in what products. They would eventually use statistics on these segments to inform marketing strategies. But if you look at the statistical tests that were available at the time, these segmentations were not always the best way to break up the data. For example, age flows smoothly between 0 and 100. And we could easily contrive a statistical test to show that as a person ages, she's more likely to buy one product over another over a set of smooth functions. But that's not how it worked in practice. Age was, and often still is, chunked into 10 or so distinct chunks. And those segments were each analyzed individually as though they were as distinct from one another as dogs are to cats. That is, ages 0 through 9 is as related to age 10 to 19 as it is to 80 through 89. What we see here is the deep influence of the technological affordances of scholarly practice, and it's an issue we still face today, though in a somewhat different form. As historians began using punch cards and social statistics, they inherited or appropriated a structure developed for bureaucratic government processing and were rightly soon criticized for its dehumanizing qualities. Unsurprisingly, given this particular backdrop, historians in the first few decades of the 20th century often shied away from or rejected quantification outright. The next wave of quantitative historians, who reached their height in the 1930s or so, approached the problem with somewhat more subtlety than the previous generations of the 1890s or the 1860s. For example, Charles Beard's famous economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States used economic and demographic statistics to argue that the US Constitution was economically motivated. Beard, however, did grasp the fundamental ideographic critique of quantitative history, claiming that history was, and I quote, "beyond the reach of mathematics, which cannot assign meaningful values to the imponderables, immeasurables, and contingencies of history." The other frequent critique of quantitative history, still heard, is that it uncritically appropriates the methods of stats and sciences. This also, at the time, was not entirely true. The slide behind me shows the famed statistician Carl Pearson attempting to replicate the math of Isaac Newton that we saw earlier using some more sophisticated techniques. By the 1940s, Americans with graduate training in stats, like Ernest Rubin, were actively engaging historians in their own journals, discussing how to carefully apply statistics to historical research. On the other side of the channel, the French annales historians were advocating longue durée history, a move away from biographies to prosopographies, from events to structures. In its own way, this was another historiography teetering on the edge between the nomothetic and the ideographic. It was an approach that sought to uncover the rhymes of history. Interest in quantitative approaches surged again in the late 1950s, led in part by a new wave of annales historians like Fernand Braudel, and the American quantitative manifestos written by people like Benson or Conrad or Meyer. William Idelette went so far as to point out that all historians implicitly quantify when they use words like many, average, representative, or growing. And the question wasn't, can there be a quantitative history, but when should formal quantitative methods be used? By 1968, George Murphy, seeing the swell of interest, asked a very familiar question, I think, to those of us in this room. Why now? He asked, why the 1960s were so different from the 1860s or the 1930s? Why were they, in that historical moment, able to finally do it right? His answer was that it wasn't just the new technologies, the huge data sets, the innovative methods. It was the zeitgeist. The 1960s was the right era for computational history because it was the era of computation. Sounds familiar. By the early 70s, there was a historian using a computer in every major history department across the United States. Quantitative history had finally come into its own. Of course, in retrospect, Murphy was wrong. Once the pendulum swung too far toward scientific history, theoretical objections began pushing it in the other direction. In Poverty of Historicism, Popper rejected scientific history, but mostly as a means to reject historicism outright. Popper's arguments represent an attack from outside the historiographic tradition, but one that eventually had significant purchase among historians as an indication of the failure of nomothetic approaches to culture. It is, to an extent, a return to Musgrave's critique of Isaac Newton. At the same time, we see growing criticism from historians themselves. Arthur Schlesinger famously wrote that important questions are important precisely because they are not susceptible to quantitative answers. There was a converging consensus among English-speaking historians, as in the early 20th century, that quantification erased the essence of the humanities, that it smoothed over the very inequalities and historical contingencies that we needed to highlight. Jacques Barzun summed it up pretty well, if scathingly, saying that history ought to free us from the bonds of the machine, not feed us into it. The skeptics prevailed, and the pendulum swung the other way. The post-structural, cultural, and literary critical turns in historiography pivoted away from computation and quantification. The final nail was probably Fogel and Engerman's 1974 Time on the Cross, which reduced the Atlantic slave trade to economic figures and didn't exactly treat the subject with nuance and care, for those of you who are familiar with it. The cliometricians, demographers, and quantitative historians didn't disappear after the cultural turn, but their numbers shrunk, and they tended to find themselves in social science departments or fled here to Europe, where social and economic historians were still faring better. Which brings us 40 years on to the middle of the new wave of quantitative or formal method history. Ed Ayers, like George Murphy before him, wrote essentially, "This time it's different." And he's right to a point. Many here today draw their roots not to the cliometricians, although many do, but to the very cultural historians who rejected quantification in the first place. Ours is a digital history steeped in the values of the cultural turn that respects social justice and seeks to use our approaches to shine a light on the underrepresented and the historically contingent. But that doesn't stop a new wave of critiques that, if not repeating old arguments, certainly rhymes. We can take, for example, Johanna Drucker's recent call to rebrand data as CAPTA, because when we treat observations objectively as if it were the same as the phenomena observed, we collapse the critical distance between the world and our interpretation of it. An interpretation, Drucker contends, is the very foundation on which humanistic knowledge is built. Which is all to say, every single swing of the pendulum between ideographic and non-methetic history was situated in its own unique historical moment. It's not like a clock pendulum, but a little bit more like Foucault's pendulum, where each swing's apex ends up in a slightly different place from the last. The issue of chronology and astronomy, of course, is different from those of eugenics and manifest destiny, which are themselves different from the capitalist and dehumanizing tendencies of 1950s mainframes. But they all do rhyme. Quantitative history has failed many times for many reasons, but there are a few threads that bind them and from which we can learn, or at least a few recurring mistakes we can recognize in ourselves and try to avoid going forward. We won't, I suspect, stop the pendulum's inevitable about face, but at least we can continue our work with caution, respect, and care. The lesson I'd like to highlight may be summed up in one question, asked by Humpty Dumpty to Alice, which is to be master. "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I mean there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said, in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make a word mean so many things. The question is," Humpty Dumpty said, "which is to be master, that's all." Over several hundred years of quantitative history, the advice of proponents and critics alike tend to align with this question. Indeed, in 1956, R.J. Collingwood wrote specifically, "Statistical research is for the historian a good servant but a bad master," referring to the fact that statistical historical patterns mean nothing without historical context. Schlesinger, the historian I mentioned earlier who said historical questions are interesting precisely because they can't be quantified, later acknowledged that while quantitative methods can be useful, they'll lead historians astray. Instead of tackling good questions, he said, historians will tackle easily quantifiable ones, and Schlesinger was uncomfortable by the tail wagging the dog. I found several ways in which historians have accidentally given over their agency to the methods and machines they use over the years. But these 5, I think, are the most relevant to our historical moment. Unfortunately, since there's not too much time in this keynote, I think you're going to have to trust me that these are historically recurring. I'm going to post something on my blog probably later this week where you can see the actual historical moments where I'm referring to in each of these cases, but I won't mention them here today. Number 1 is the uncareful appropriation of statistical methods for historical uses. It controls us precisely because it offers us a black box whose output we don't truly understand. A common example I see these days is in that of network visualization. People visualize nodes and edges using what are called force-directed layouts, often in a program called Gephi. But they don't exactly understand what those layouts mean, and as these layouts were designed, physical proximity of nodes is not meant to resent relatedness. Yet I've seen historians too often, interpret 2 neighboring nodes as being related because of their visual adjacency, even when they themselves are not. And this is bad, it's false. But because we don't quite understand what's happening, we get lured by the black box into nonsensical interpretations. The second way that methods drive us in our reliance on is on our reliance of methodological imports. That is, we take the time to open the black box, but we only use methods that we learn from statisticians or scientists. Even when we fully understand the methods we import, if we're bound to other people's analytic machinery, we're bound to their questions and to their biases. Take the example I mentioned earlier with demographic segmentation, punched card sorters, and its influence on social science statistics. The very mechanical affordances of early computers influenced the sort of questions people asked for decades. How do discrete groups of people react to the world in different ways, and how do they compare to one another? The next thing I think we need to watch out for is naive scientism. Even if you know the assumptions of your methods, and you develop your own techniques for the problem at hand, you can still fall into the positivist trap that Johanna Drucker warned us about, collapsing the distance between what we observe and some underlying truth. This is specifically, this is especially difficult when dealing with big data. Once you're working with so much material you couldn't hope to read it all, it's easy to be lured into forgetting the distance between operationalizations and what you actually intended to measure in the first place. For instance, if I'm looking for friendships in early modern Europe by looking for particular words being written in correspondences, I'll completely miss the existence of friends who were neighbors and thus had no reason to write letters to one another because they could just walk next door. So this is something that we need to watch out for. A fourth way that we can be misled by quantitative methods is the ease with which they lend an air of false precision or false certainty. This is the problem that Matthew Lincoln and the other panelists brought up yesterday afternoon, where missing or uncertain data, once quantified, falsely appears precise enough to be able to make comparisons. I see this mistake crop up in early and recent quantitative histories alike. We measure, say, the changing rate of transnational shipments over time, and we notice a positive trend, and we write about it. The problem is the positive difference is quite small, easily attributable to error, but because numbers always look precise, 7.2, it still feels like we're being more precise than doing a qualitative assessment, even when it's unwarranted. The last thing to watch out for, and maybe the most worrisome, is the blinders that quantitative analysis places on historians who don't engage in other historiographic methods. This has been the downfall of many waves of quantitative history in the past, the inability to care about or even see that which cannot be counted. This was in part what led to Time on the Cross becoming the excuse to drive historians from cliometrics. The indicators of slavery that were measurable were sufficient to show it to have some semblance of economic success for black populations, but it was precisely those aspects of slavery they could not measure that were the most historically important, and that Fogel and Engerman neglected to discuss. So the question then is, how do we regain mastery in light of these obstacles? Regarding the uncareful appropriation of methods, we can easily sidestep the issue of accidental misuse by collaborating with someone who actually knows how the method works. This may require a translator. Statisticians can just as easily misunderstand historical problems as historians can misunderstand statistics. But historians and statisticians can fruitfully collaborate, though, if they have someone in the middle trained to some extent in both, even if they're not experts in either. For what it's worth, from what I've seen of Dutch institutions, you all seem to be very far ahead of the game in this respect, which is something that I think needs to be fostered elsewhere. Getting away from reliance on disciplinary imports may take some more work, I think, because we ourselves have to learn the approaches well enough to augment them or to create our own. Right now in DH, this is often handled by summer institutes and workshop series, but I'd argue that those are not sufficient here. We need to make room in our curricula for actual methodological courses, or even degrees focused on methodology in the same fashion as the social scientists, if we want to start a robust practice of developing appropriate tools for our own research. Now, obviously, that's not an overnight fix, but if there are any, funders or heads of colleges in the room who want to work with me to build a curriculum, I'm happy to talk after the talk. So be in touch. The specter of naive scientism, I think, is one we need to be pretty careful of, but we're also already pretty well equipped to deal with this. If we want to combat the uncareful use of proxies in digital history, we need only to teach the history of the humanities, the lessons that we're learning today. Why the cultural turn happened, what's gone wrong with positivistic approaches to history in the past, and so forth. Incidentally, I think that this is something that digital historians already guard pretty well against, especially compared to groups from 40 years ago. But it's still worth keeping in mind and making sure we teach it. Particularly, digital historians need to remain aware of the parallel approaches from the past, rather than tracing their background only to the textual work of people like Roberto Bussa in Italy. False precision and false certainty have some shallow fixes and some deep ones. In the short term, we need to be better about understanding things like confidence intervals and error bars, and use methods like simulation methods like what Matthew Lincoln highlighted yesterday. In the long term, though, digital history would do well to adopt triangulation strategies to help mitigate against these issues. That means trying to reach the same conclusion using multiple different methods in parallel and seeing if they all agree. If they do, you can be more certain your results are something you can trust and not just an accident of the method you happen to be using at the time. Avoiding quantitative blinders, that is, the tendency to only care about what's easily countable, is an easy fix, but I'm a little bit afraid to say it because it might put me out of a job eventually. We can't call what we do digital history, or quantitative history, or cliometrics, or whatever else. We are simply historians. Some of us use more quantitative methods and some don't, but if we're ultimately contributing to the same body of work, both sides will do themselves a disservice not by bringing every approach to bear in the wide range of interests historians ought to pursue. Qualitative and ideographic historians will be stuck unable to deal with the deluge of material that can paint us a broader picture of history, and quantitative or nomothetic historians will lose sight of the very human irregularities that make history worth studying in the first place. We must work together, in short. If we don't, we're destined to remain punched card humanists. That is, we'll always be constrained and led by the methods or the mechanics, not by the historical questions. Of course, this divide is a false one. There are no purely quantitative or purely qualitative studies. Close reading historians will always continue to say things like representative or increasing, and digital historians won't start publishing graphs with no interpretation, at least I hope not. Still, silos exist, and some of us have trouble leaving the comfort of our digital humanities conferences or our traditional history conferences. That's why this conference, I think, is so refreshing. It offers a great mix of both worlds. And I'm privileged and thankful to have been able to attend. While there are a lot of lessons we can still learn from those before us, from my vantage point, I think we're on the right track. And I do look forward to seeing more of this work, this collaborative work being done today. Thank you.